So, Reid, I'd love to know what, in your view, is the primary role and responsibility of a technology reporter like Kara Swisher? Like, where are the lines between sharing personal opinion, being highly critical of those with power, but also thinking positively about the future?
Well, it's a great question. And, one of the reasons why I've been a fan of Kara's for many years is I do think that it's important to always have people speaking truth to power. And obviously, major technology founders, companies, et cetera, have a lot of power these days. And so I think it's important to have people criticizing them, including, as has happened over the years, criticizing me, which is, I think, a very good thing. And I think it's one of the good things. And I think people who get overly bent out of shape about the criticism, are really being thin-skinned, very narrowly self-interested, and a bunch of other things. So I think it's a good thing to have the criticism. Now, that being said, I also share a frequent frustration within the tech industry that when all you have is criticism, it actually does a lot of harm, because it says just bad, as opposed to, well, good and bad, and let's steer towards more of the good and less of the bad. And that doesn't mean it needs to be puffed up or something, but it's like, it's kind of things like people say, well, what has Google ever given me for its use of my data? And the answer is, well, free search, right? Which is pretty handy for a lot of people. And similarly, it's like, well, I'm recording the evils of big tech on my iPhone as I'm doing it. And you're like, well, okay, the iPhone is actually, in fact, a pretty instrumental thing navigating a whole bunch of places in the world. And like, for example, like a classic one that's a very du jour topic amongst a lot of areas is how technology creates, kind of mental health issues, loneliness, etc. And I think there are some issues that are real there and need to be improved. But also, on the other hand, by the way, technology creates a lot of connection. You can FaceTime with people and you can share pictures and a bunch of other things. And it's like, well, but we see these other mental health issues. Like, yeah, that's the reason why it's a complicated landscape. It's kind of like if you said, there's 1,000 people and 900 of them get better connection and 5 of them have mental health issues. That's one issue. And if 100 of them get better connections and 100 of them have worse mental health issues, that's a different issue. And people are unprecise in that because they hang up that one thing. And that leads into some of the challenges with journalism, because it's like telling that negative story of that one person who, got crushed by this thing, and look, it's bad. It's like, well, it really resonates with us as homo narratus, kind of storytellers, but it actually, in fact, leads us to very wrong conclusions and things. And that's one of the things where I worry that, journalists do have to hold the critical role, but sometimes cloak themselves in it in a way that they go, look, it's not about judgment. And of course, it's convenient if it's not about judgment, because if everything you're saying is really negative, it's just like covering the burning buildings or the plane crashes on things, and you get more click-through and you get more attention, and so it tells you that you're doing the right thing. Whereas really, just like, for example, there's a role for holding technology leaders accountable to saying, look, what are the things you're doing well and what are the things you're doing wrong? I think it's also holding tech journalists accountable for what are the things you're doing right and what are the things you're doing wrong. And part of the thing I think that happens too often wrong within tech journalists, or maybe journalists generally, but certainly tech journalists, is it's all about the wrong and not about the balance of it. For example, when I look at a lot of the subjects that are the choices of journalist ire, take Meta/Facebook, if you read through it, it's like, it can't do anything right. Everything it's doing is wrong. And you're like, well, but 1 billion people are using it every day, very voluntarily. There's nothing that really comes and do it. And when I talk to a lot of people who are using it, there's a lot of good things that are coming out of it. And so, you almost by definition know that the press coverage is very slanted and stilted and directional for some set of purposes. Now, that being said, I myself have been a critic of Meta in its civic responsibilities and kind of how do you interpret freedom of speech, and how does that play out to it, both a virtue, but how do you manifest it within a media ecosystem of a democracy? But I also see all of the wonderful things that it brings. It's that balance of helping us navigate and kind of forming kind of a zeitgeist set of opinions and ideas about the current state of things, about where things might move to, where things could possibly move to, is actually, in fact, I think the thing that tech journalism needs to do more of, while it, of course, still occupies its critical role.
Yeah, it's really interesting. One of our close colleagues, I won't call him out on the pod, but he has a really interesting point about the technology is often disrupting itself. So when people talk about the music industry and, Spotify's terrible because artists used to be able to make money by selling CDs, it's like, well, 100 years ago, artists couldn't make money anyway because there was no CD, there was no cassette, there was no record player, there was nothing. It's like we needed that technology to give these people a living and a way to reach the masses, which was really amazing. And that technology has been progressing. And, we hope, again, that journalists will hold people accountable, but we'll also see sort of the amazing new things that can happen. And so you brought up Facebook, Meta. Another social media company that's obviously super in the news is TikTok. And I am, as a mom of kids, like I'm pretty moved by the fact that we've seen teenagers say, I would pay money every month if no one could use TikTok. Like I feel compelled to use it because I need to, keep up with the Joneses and keep up with my friends. That doesn't seem to me to be a reason to ban something. Maybe there's regulation, maybe there's worries about young people using it and there should be an over 18, something like that. But I think what is more interesting is the law we have around foreign ownership. Right now, if you want to run the New York Times, you have to be a U.S. citizen. And so it seems to be sort of that framing is what legislators are talking about when they're talking about TikTok, either, divesting, being banned, it has to change ownership. I would love to know what you think. Like, is this a way you think we should be going with TikTok and not allowing foreign ownership?
Well, a whole stack of TikTok questions. Let's start with the simplest one, which is, China implements regulation against any foreign tech companies, including the U.S., to indicate that they can't be, foreign majority owned and have license to operate within China. And so I think the baseline is it's quite fair for any other country to then say, well, of Chinese companies, right, we will then do the same. If you're going to do that to our companies and prospective companies, we will do the same to you. Cutting through all of the noise of discussions of shoulds and censorship and preference and all the rest, I think that's a baseline okay thing for any country to do, right, including the U.S. And that also then makes it not hypocritical of the U.S. to say, well, actually, in fact, you shouldn't be regulating or banning Meta, Twitter, LinkedIn, et cetera, in these different countries, because we only do that responsively as opposed to prospectively responsibly. And we think that kind of general open ecosystem is we prefer it, we will do that. So that's kind of point one. Now, point two is I do think that one of the things in terms of all online kind of media spaces is we're learning new things, and the presumption that the old world order is the same one that should apply to the new world order when we have these different things of everybody on all the time, through their mobile phones and through these services, about how it extends the Lord of the Flies atmosphere of a school and the prison yard of a school, into the home and all the rest, for these things. And what that means is, I think, needs to be thought of anew. It isn't just like, well, we have these old principles and that's it, we're done, we made those decisions. It's like, no, what actually in fact happened? And so I'm actually in fact pretty sympathetic, like I am in many things, about saying we make decisions about what can children do and what could they possibly, it's one of the reasons why it's like, well, can't drive to a certain time and can't, have guns and can't drink and a bunch of other things to say, look, there's children. Obviously, it's a broad brush measure. Some people are mature enough to make decisions by the age of 14 or 16, and other people aren't mature enough by the age of 30 or 40. But, we kind of say, okay, 18 or 21 in order to do that. And that's the classic kind of broad brush public policy. And I think the notion of saying, look, how should we engage with and be the right level of both protective and selectively opening up that protectiveness to have children decide their own things is, I think, a very good thing. Now, the question is, when you get to TikTok, you're like, well, but there is a good thing about people expressing their voices. There is a good thing about the ability to kind of form community. There's a bunch of good things that come out of that. Actually, on TikTok, just like on YouTube, there's a bunch of how-to information and other kinds of things that are in it. And so you're like, okay, so what does that mean for how we should balance it? Now, taking restrictions for children makes total sense. And then you have to have some consideration for what that should be. As to your question, I think a lot of parents would also go, well, shit, I will try to ban TikTok and then my kids hate me. I kind of rather the government do it. And it's like, it's like, I'm just doing that. And so, there may be some responsibility, kind of in forum there. And, maybe it's also kind of a question of, as opposed to just kind of like idiosyncratic, it's like, well, what are the attributes that we should say, when can children be, part of free form communities, and what are the attributes of the free form communities? Like, is there things where you say, well, like TikTok, it's fine from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. right? And it's great. And that's what it is. And that's, or something like that. There's timing variables. There's, kind of what kind of content, kind of regulation, kind of what kind of adult participation, parental participation, guidance, all of that stuff. I think we should be principled about it versus, ad hoc. And then now, of course, is when someone smart goes, well, Reid, what universe are you living in? We don't seem to do that anywhere else. And he's like, yeah, it's an aspirational goal, right? It's, what we're trying to get to. And so, as you know, and I think share, it's kind of this question of, look, it's not just as it is, hit it with stick, ban it, but how do we shape it so it's actually much more positive? I am very attentive to the importance around, mental health issues and everything else, and how do we shape these so that they're more positive? Like, I think one of the fundamental points, whether it's TikTok, but also Meta and Twitter, is not to say, it's like, look, are you saying there's nothing you can do? Like, there's no low-hanging fruit to make small modifications that increase the level of positive, kind of civic discussion, mental health, etc. You're saying there's nothing you can do, and you should allow the people who are out there running around going, kill the minority X or whatever else, and that's the more important thing to allow, right? It's like, really? Like, let's have this discussion on, like, what are some, and nothing will be perfect, but what are some small things we could do to improve that and figure that out? And that's part of the reason why the discussion of criticism of these things I find frustrating, when it's like, shut it all down, as opposed to both the critics and the proponents saying, look, what are the specific things we would do to improve it?
Possible is produced by Wonder Media Network. It's hosted by Ari Finger and me, Reid Hoffman. Our showrunner is Sean Young. Possible is produced by Katie Sanders, Edie Allard, Sarah Schleid, Adrian Bain, and Paloma Moreno Jimenez. Jenny Kaplan is our executive producer and editor.
Special thanks to Surya Yalamanchili, Saida Sepieva, Ian Ellis, Greg Beato, Ben Rellis, Parth Patil, and Little Monster Media Company.